Hello, everyone, and welcome to what I forgot how to do the math. What is the third anniversary episode of Everyday Anarchism? Does that sound right to you, Ruth? Is this the third time
Yeah,
we've done this?
yeah, that sounds about right.
So this is 2024, September of 2024, and I started this podcast in September of 2021, and you were one of my first guests. We talked about Kropotkin and Santa Claus in December of 2021. So we're not quite up yet to 3 years of Ruth Kinna on this podcast, but we're very close. So thank you, Ruth, for coming back again. Let's do it again.
Yeah, well, congratulations on your third anniversary.
It's been a lot of work. Anyone who's been listening all along knows that the rate of episodes has slowed down, has definitely slowed down, but we're still going. Over 100 episodes, not all of which unfortunately feature Ruth Kinna, but a good half dozen do, I think, something like that. So I as we were talking about what we were going to talk about for our now annual conversation, I mentioned to you that I had this conversation with the philosopher Roman Krznaric about
Mhm.
Colin Ward. I should say, Roman, my apologies for misspelling your name when I posted that episode. My bad. I hope Roman is listening to this and he hears this heartfelt apology. I'm so sorry. I even, I triple checked it. And late in that conversation, Roman said something on the lines of, "We've been so positive about Colin Ward's philosophy, but we can also talk about where he has some blind spots or deficiencies. And one of them is that Colin was very much, an everyday anarchist. He didn't go in for wide scale protest and activism. And as anyone who listened to that episode knows, my response was sort of equivocal because I am, I guess, ambivalent or agnostic about protest and activism and how it fits into my sense of
Mm.
everyday anarchism. If you listen to the first episode of the show, I tried to contrast what we might think of as an anarchist, the black bloc protesters or the window smashers, the people in the Guy Fawkes mask, with the everyday anarchists, the people who are
Yeah.
making gardens and taking neighbors in. And I don't think these things are totally incompatible, and one of them is anarchist or one isn't. But after doing this for 3 years, I still haven't solved this sort of conundrum of what is everyday anarchism and where does it fit in with capital A anarchism. So
Mm.
if I've thrown out enough for you to get started there, then please just get started.
Yeah. So, I mean, it is. I think it is a really tricky question because protest itself it seems to be a loaded word. It's not a word of our making. It's a word of the sort of democracy's making, of liberal democracy's making. And then there's, I mean, the separate question, I guess, is the issue of repertoire and what's legitimate or what's useful or what's compatible with a politics that wants to bring about a different kind of social relationships and how far replicating activities that are out there already achieves that. I mean, but I guess, I mean, even actually, perhaps especially in Colin Ward, there is a sort of blurring, I think, between types of action. And I mean, the example that comes to mind is squatting. So one of the things that Colin Ward advocated early on in the post-war period was that when there was a housing crisis, just as there is now, was that actually a way of sort of expressing or constructively the disagreement, if you like, with the way in which government was sort of controlling housing was to take direct action and to squat and hold on to the squat for as long as possible, so that by being confrontational, if you like, you were also challenging a culture that was based on a set of property relations that otherwise were excluding you from available housing because it either wasn't on the market or it was being kept back on the market from the market by those who owned it for one reason or another. So I think there's a way of thinking about um, direct action, which sort of encourages us to get round the protest problem. Because so much of what's designated, or so much of what we disagree about tends to have its root, I think, in this idea of what's a legitimate protest, and that question is not of our making. That question is of the making of those who want to filter out noise that they don't want to listen to, and regulate political action in a particular way, a way in which you have a sort of a fringe mechanism, or a sort of another mechanism to let your leaders hear your complaint, but which is going to be judged by values that are themselves constraining. And I think that's where I'd want to start.
Yeah, no, that sounds great. Do you have a printer going,
Yeah,
Ruth? Yeah,
sorry.
well, okay. the wor-
We'll
just
we'll stop it.
all right. I mean, I an episode that I recorded recently, I think will air after this. I recorded in my office, and the building next to my office is being gutted. So there was construction noises all through
Oh
that
dear,
episode.
I'm
So
sorry.
um, yes. Well, I mean, the only regret is that they haven't gutted the building my office is in, because boy, does it need to be gutted. It's one of those brutalist monstrosities from the '60s. All right. Yes. So I think this question of legitimacy and like what we mean by protest is a great place to start. I mean, I guess first to reassure, I have in my head, I don't know if this person exists, but this radical listener who listens to my podcast, but is always offended by how liberal and bourgeois my politics are. So to first assure that radical listener, um, I don't accept at all. Yeah, I think this idea of like there's legitimate protests. One of the things you see now in the discourse is like, I don't know, like time, place, and appropriate action. I don't know. There's some slogans about when protests are acceptable and when they are not. And this is precisely this legitimacy policing that you are talking about. Of course, I support the right to free speech, but you can't interrupt people's day or make people uncomfortable or something like that. And then I think you're right to point the finger at this question of liberal democracy, which says the people are in charge,
Hmm.
but the people are in charge in this very mediated way.
Hmm.
And so protest is acceptable according to liberal democracy in the right time and place, and protest is supposed to be aimed at the decision makers, the establishment, the powers that be, to try and change their mind. And then one of the things that the establishment is allowed to say is, this was a nice protest, except for the dozen of you we had to arrest
Arrest.
because you were on the street or something. But we don't have to do anything about it. But of course, you can vote us out in the next election, which is
Yeah.
really the proper way to express your displeasure. And I want to again reassure this hypothetical radical, I'm not buying this at all.
No.
This idea that is the protest is it's just free speech where you happen to be outside,
Yeah.
and it happens in very narrow limits, and it shouldn't really accomplish anything except maybe make a Guardian headline.
Yeah.
That's obviously not good enough.
Yes, it's a protection for the system, essentially.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so then something like squatting strikes me as precisely the kind of direct action that one can get behind. I mean, as you know, as everyone knows, Graeber was my entry into
Mm.
anarchist theory, and he we'll get to Occupy in a second. I think we'll have to get to Occupy, of
Uh,
course, but one of his big things about Occupy and about many protests is the goal is not to become part of the system, not to become a mouthpiece of the protesters who then speaks to the PR person for the police, who then relays the information to the governor, and then the governor decides whether to act or not. That if that's what protest is, Graeber
yeah.
didn't want anything to do with it, and it seems to me doesn't have much to do with anarchism.
So the idea is that you're not taking action. You're not asking to be permitted to do something. You're not making a claim to those in charge. I mean, which is why I guess the tradition has always called anarchist action direct as opposed to mediated or parliamentary or political, because what you're trying to do is, even if actually the action does make people listen and sit up, even if it does contribute to a social policy change, and I don't think Colin Ward would have been sort of necessarily averse to that, what you're doing is you're taking the action in order to meet the aim rather than to make a request of those in power to do something for you. So that's why it is unmediated. It's not permissive in that sense, and I think that kind of character of direct action always then creates the spectre of something that's going to be uncontrolled, untamed, potentially violent because it's aggressive, it's, or confrontational. It's not listening to those who are in charge in order to make its demand, or perhaps demand is the wrong word, in order to make its statement.
Yeah, excellent. And I think, this makes sense. So if we wanted to think about one of the things Colin Ward says is, from the perspective of the system is like people are housed
Yeah,
or unhoused. And if we think about any, earlier and less bureaucratic system, housing wasn't something that was looked at from this sort of top down way. People sought shelter, people constructed shelter. Sheltering, housing themselves was something people did. It's something communities did. It doesn't make sense to think of it in this, in this sort of spreadsheet sort of way, this top down governmental perspective. Okay, we have 72 million people and dwellings for
yeah,
71 million people. Therefore, we need to build dwellings for 1 million people, and we'll make sure the cladding is totally flammable. I mean, this entire system
yeah,
is that's how you get things like the Grenfell tragedy is
yeah,
bureaucrats with spreadsheets, quote, housing people instead of
yeah.
people housing themselves.
Yeah,
But
and
then you want
actually,
to
I
say,
mean,
oh, go
Grenfell's
ahead.
a
Yeah.
really brilliant example, I think, because what was going on in Grenfell in that tower before the fire was a perfect example of self organising and, if you like, a kind of a direct action approach to try and get the authorities to do something about uh, the obvious unsafety of the building. Um, and if you like, I mean, there's something that Voltaire declares as about direct action, which I really like, which is that it's actually in people's political DNA, if you will, to organise themselves in these ways. And I think that's where the crossover with everyday anarchism exists, because people don't naturally um, seek permission to do something. What they do is that they seek to cooperate and that's Ward's insight, to collaborate and cooperate with other people in order to achieve an end. And I think that's what direct action, or protest in an anarchist sense, is best understood.
Yeah. Oh, I think that's fantastic. And then the problem is the place I wanted to guide this example of housing is if you think of something like, listeners of the show know that I love Winstanley. When Stanley says there's land out there and there's no one using it and we can just use it. And we can imagine, in a sort of primitive anarchist sense, this working. We can imagine everyone housing themselves and feeding themselves this way. The problem is, as Winstanley learned, even if no one is using the land, or to bring it up to date, if you go into an apartment building that no one is using and you start squatting in it,
Mm-hmm.
someone will come along and claim that even though they are not using it, it is nevertheless
Theirs.
theirs.
Mm-hmm.
and the violence of the state should be used to remove you, unless, I mean, there's countries, again, thinking of like social changes, there's countries like Germany where squatting is basically not protected in the United States, perhaps in
Mm-hmm.
some municipalities, but we don't have that culture of squatting. But in Germany, of course, it's a legalistic thing, and so it can be protected or not protected depending on technicalities, and
Mm-hmm.
corporations and landlords can manipulate the system. It's not what Winstanley was doing. um and then, of course, as you're being dragged by the police from the place you're squatting in and being hit with the club, they say, stop resisting, and why
Yeah.
why did you make us do this to you. And that's where it seems like the
Yeah.
everyday anarchism comes crashing into the need for direct confrontation with state violence.
Yeah, and well, that's right. But I guess, I guess anything that falls out. I mean, as I say, anything that sort of falls outside the sort of the negotiated space of protest is always likely to encounter that kind of problem. So I guess one of the one of um, the aspirations of the direct activist is to build the mutual aid systems in such a way as, you know, you do get at least, or you can at least attempt to resist the violence that you know is going to be brought against you. So it's a sort of a, and again, I think that's another sort of difference with protest. That protest is within the liberal state is tends to be conceived of a sort of um, a single shot issue. So you've got a grievance about something, and you can air your grievance, and you know your representatives will hear you, and something will happen. You know, the direct activist is involved in a process which is always going to be, or always threatens to be, interrupted, because it's confronting an established practice or a norm in a particular way, and you might get away with it for a certain amount of time, but eventually you have to anticipate that the force is going to be used against you. And I think that's really where um, the negative connotations of direct action come from. From its by its critics, that, you know, the direct activist is of course involved in violence, and that comes in union organizing or anything. It's someone who's not going to be um, calmed, if you will, by the legalistic approaches. It's someone who's challenging those from the outset. I would also say that, you know, the Winstanley approach, I think, is really interesting. That example, you know, that we all have the capacity to sort of come across a piece of land and use it. The other thing about the direct action is because you might come across a piece of land and think that no one's using it, but somebody else might also think that it's theirs. And I guess one of the things about direct action, if you take it out of the sort of the relationship with the constituted authorities, but you're having to negotiate differences with people who make rival claims. And you have to think about ways in which you're going to be dealing with that. So, and the same thing happens with freedoms of speech. That the direct action approach says, well, you know, we can't solve this by appealing to the law. We have to solve it by actually working out where it is we disagree and how we're going to deal with that difference directly.
Yeah, and I mean, I think again the basic claim of, you know, democratic liberalism is that none of these questions can be dealt with directly. They
That's
have to
right.
go to whose land is it? Well, you know, let's get the lawyers involved. Is
Yeah.
this speech protected in this space? Let's get the lawyers involved. Are you allowed to live in this house? Well, that depends on what the lawyers say.
Yeah.
And something that stuck with me, you know, in my pre-anarchist phase, but I think we were reading David Graeber at the time in a grad school class, is, you know, we were talking in sort of whatever abstract terms about the police and their role and the role of the state. And my professor in that class, John McGowan, who listeners will have heard on this podcast a few times, he said something like, you know, this isn't how you think of the police, but odds are good if the police are called, they're being called by someone who you are intimately connected with on you, or you're calling them on someone who you're intimately connected on you. The police are normally responding to disputes between family members, loved ones,
Mm-hmm.
neighbors. This idea that the police are out there on the streets preventing us from bandits, that's absurd. That's and this idea that that is the state's job, is to come into our homes and use force on our loved ones. That there's I don't know, I guess now I'm just spluttering, there's something wrong there, but that insight has stuck with me, and it's one of the things that pushed me to try and understand differently how to think about the law. It seems so simple. Oh, we need a justice system that gets things right and then uses force when necessary, but in fact
Mm-hmm.
it comes into the most intimate
That's
parts
right.
of our lives, and we must be able to solve these questions. Oh, are you using that land? It doesn't look like you're using that land. Surely getting the court involved is not the way to solve this problem.
No, I think that's right. And the argument, again, of people like Voltaire and de Cleyre, I think, is that it's through resolving that conflict that you arrive at a notion of justice on which you can both agree, or all parties involved in it can
Hmm.
agree, and that justice is not fixed. It can't be fixed because actually, our relationships are messy, and we're going to, things that we thought were okay yesterday are not going to be okay tomorrow. And we have to sort of resolve those issues directly, and it's not always comfortable or kind um, or without harm. But unless we do that, we can't actually uh, uh, think meaningfully about what we think is right and wrong, and um, what is going to sort of satisfy us, at least for the next couple of weeks, if not a bit longer. Conflict is part and parcel of thinking about what is just, I think. Um, and we can see that historically. And the problem with law is that it's often very slow. There are vested interests in it. It's not neutral from the start. I mean, that's for sure. And so it's very difficult to sort of turn these things around. The advantage of, however painful it may be, of sorting things out directly is that it is much more adaptable, and people have to participate in it directly, and it's hard, but I think that's the advantage of it.
I think as we're talking through this, I'm thinking also of a claim that you would get from a progressive center left, whatever you want to say, with something on the lines of, you think no one is using that land, but actually that land is very valuable because it's,
Mm-hmm.
preventing flooding, and if you put a cabin on that land, something else will flood. So there's this sense that you need a sort of top down planning mode, that the values of anarchism or socialism or democracy or whatever you want to say are good, but the system is complicated,
Mm-hmm.
and you just need someone in in charge who sees the big
The big
picture. I
picture.
mean, this is what I hear most of the time when I have conversations about anarchism. Well, yeah, sure, that all sounds nice. We should all be able to regulate our own lives, but we obviously can't regulate the floodplain. I have a quick and easy response, which is the reason why we have the floodplain is because these goddamn corporations built all these horrible buildings that as investment properties that no one is living in. But
Mm.
that I think people just feel like that's a cheap and easy answer, and they want a better sense of how we could, I don't know, govern ourselves in this way. No, even though we don't want government, how do we say, if we just leave people alone and let them live where they want to live, how do we manage our communities in such a way? Again, it seems that the current authorities are not doing a good job of managing, but that's too
That's right.
easy.
And I think the answer is that you can't manage in the same way. You can't expect anarchist approaches to deliver the same services as you get in state systems, just in a different way. It's not going to work, So I guess, the answer to the question of, well, who's going to collect the rubbish every week. The answer. I mean, maybe it's too simplistic, but the answer is, well, maybe you have to think about getting rid of less.
Yeah.
To start off with.
Yeah.
You have to change your way, your whole outlook, if you like, if you're going to manage things directly through your cooperation or your direct action. It simply can't replace what's there. It's not going to work like that. It has to simplify, and there are costs of that. Of course, there are
Yeah.
trade-offs. Um,
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Well, I briefly discussed in my conversation with Brad DeLong, who was the Clinton administration economist who came on the show, and I brought up William Morris,
mm,
and he said something like, those people just live in, the people in News from Nowhere live in a less wealthy society, and we shouldn't. I don't want to misquote him. He said something like, "We shouldn't have to settle for that," or something like that. And
Yeah,
I want to
but
say
it's
something more like, yeah, go ahead.
but it's. I mean, Morris's distinction is between wealth and riches,
Yeah,
which he gets from Ruskin, right? So what your wealth consists of is your well-being and what makes you flourish, what enables you to flourish. It's not the amount of stuff you accumulate. And and the other part of that critique is that, well, it's all very, I can't remember, so it's all very well to say, we shouldn't have to settle, but actually, when we don't settle, the rest of the world absolutely does.
yeah,
The costs of providing for the well being of Europe and America is massive, and it's getting worse and worse and worse, that differential, and it's being felt not only in terms of material well-being now, but actual physical existence. When you see someone's land being overwhelmed by rises in sea level, then that's the cost of this. You simply can't justify it, and the direct action, if you like, is migration. I mean, that's what people are
yeah,
doing. They're moving, and there's, for a certain amount of time, maybe you can put the walls up, but you can't do that forever.
yeah. No, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, this is another this is another common refrain from a center left person, something like, well, sure, it all sounds good, but I mean, we need to have borders or something like that. And, well, we don't. I
But
mean,
we don't have
but
borders.
yeah, exactly. I mean, we're not. Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right in terms of the question of the sanitation question. I mean, if you left people to manage themselves and you just let them live somewhere, even though they weren't supposed to be living there, who would take care of the trash? Well, yeah, I think you're right, Ruth. If we weren't pumping the minerals out of Saudi Arabia to send them to China to be turned into plastic crap and then send them back to the United States, where we then throw them out and need someone to drive a fossil fuel truck to take them away from us, well, then that solves the sanitation problem. Just leave the
That's right.
oil in the ground and stop making the Chinese economy be based around plastic crap for Americans and Europeans, and then I think the sanitation problem will resolve itself. I'm totally sympathetic to this,
Yeah.
but it does require an ability to imagine a truly different world, I
It
think.
does, and I guess that's the value of however short lived they are, of experiments that people undertake to try and do that, and actually some of them are quite long lived. So those sorts of efforts, to set up different kinds of community provisions, different ways of living. All of these can teach us, and of course, we have an awful lot to learn still from people who have never been entirely integrated into these global systems in the first place, who manage to sustain themselves, who uh, live fulfilled lives, who just live differently. I think that's where we learn, and I think it's very, very difficult for us, when everything has been provided, to think that you could possibly do it without all of those security blankets and safety nets, and to remember, as Colin Ward taught us, that insurance schemes were taken up by the state after they'd seen Welsh miners or miners in Lancashire or wherever it was, organising mutual aid for themselves. It is really difficult. I don't minimise the challenges, but something has to give. We simply can't carry on
Yeah,
like
I
this.
think so. A lot of my conversations, of course, are with other progressives, other professionals, bourgeois liberals, whatever you want to say. And I do think, you've just said two very important things. One, which they're very comfortable with, is that something has to give. They've all internalized climate change and that something
Mhm.
needs to change. I think they want, solar panels and Teslas, not quite the reimagining of the world economy. The other thing is, though, I think you're absolutely right. They need to be reminded. I need to be reminded. They'll say something like, people will die, people will go hungry, something like that. That it's hard to imagine a world in which more people would go hungry, especially in such affluence than the one we have. It's not visible to us in that way. So when you
Yeah.
have conversations with professors and think tankers who say, so, then people might not have shelter. I'm like, well, there's
Yeah.
lots of people without shelter. They're just not in your
Neck of the woods.
neighborhood.
Yeah.
And you don't want to think of yourself as an imperialist who has armed goons taking stuff from people
Yeah.
who could use it and transmuting it into your riches. But that is what we are.
Yeah. Yeah. That's right. And I find it. I mean, even a minimal amount of imagination could take us from thinking about replacing the number of cars we have in the world with electric cars, with thinking about not having personal vehicles.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, in cities, seriously, we all have to still have an electric car. I mean, this is just madness. I mean, and again, Colin Ward, Freedom to Go, was it, where he talks about car culture,
Yeah.
and that again, it's a minimal leap to think about what the world might be if we didn't all automatically have a vehicle.
This is where I give one of my occasional shout outs to Ebenezer Howard, who has this brilliant vision that's supposedly discredited, but is not discredited at all. The Garden Cities of Tomorrow, which is
Yeah,
cities that are dense and walkable and livable and linked by transit and also surrounded by green spaces. It's totally possible. He figured it out more than a century ago. We could do it. Everyone would be happier. We would have to imagine a different a different kind of freedom. The
yeah,
car in your driveway represents a certain kind of freedom for you, not the kind of freedom you want, I think, because I'd much rather live closer to my neighbors and have more kids for my kids to play with and that sort of thing. And it would be easier to get a pickup soccer game. I would be more free if there was a pickup soccer game that my kids could join more easily than having a car in my driveway. And then, of course, the car doesn't represent freedom for the rest of the world, from whom the materials have been extracted to
yeah,
create that vehicle. I think that's
yeah,
absolutely right.
yeah. That's right. So I guess just again, sort of looking around at different ways that different cities organize transport, different kinds of infrastructure. I mean, all of these are entirely possible, and actually, the possibility of them happening comes from below, and comes from people experimenting and living in different ways.
Okay, so that's the perfect segue to one thing that's looming here that we haven't talked about, which is Occupy, in
Uh-huh.
particular Occupy Wall Street. So I am enthusiastic about Occupy. I think it was great. I don't think it failed. I mean, there's a sort of like a protest narrative that it didn't fail, in that the politics of the Biden administration here in the States have more or less in many ways been the politics of Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. And so you can say, I mean, I think Elizabeth Warren said this. I think this is true, that the Occupy drawing attention to debt
Hmm.
and leading to Bernie Sanders' campaign, which revitalized democratic socialism or social democracy in the United States. I think that's all true. So if you want to judge Occupy the same way you would judge the civil rights movement, did it lead to governmental changes to the left? I would say yes. I would say yes, it did. But that's not really what I'm interested in.
Yeah,
I'm interested in the fact that these people lived differently, and eventually, precisely for the reasons we've been talking about, the government said, no, no, you haven't cleaned up the trash. That is why
yeah,
Occupy was shut down. Is it was explained to them by Mayor Bloomberg, that they could not keep the park clean,
yeah,
as if New York City is. Anyone who's ever lived in New York City knows that it has a trash and feces and rats
yeah,
problem, and I have no doubt that the Zuccotti Park was cleaner. And I have no doubt that those people would be there now in their tents Occupy. I mean, perhaps I'm wrong, but I think Occupy would have only grown except the cudgel was applied.
Yeah.
And then people turn around and say, well, it failed. It
Yeah.
stopped. It ended. That's it. They were beaten out
Yeah.
of their places.
Out of their skins. Yeah.
Yeah.
And pressure was put on to do that. Yeah, the sanitation laws were used against them. Um, all sorts of things were said about. I mean, this happened in London too. It happened in Oakland. All sorts of things were said about the appalling condition of the camps, much of which wasn't true. I mean, one of the shocking things about Occupy London was that the occupiers at St Paul's were beaten over the head by the Daily Mail for being inundated with street homeless. Well, that's because they had nowhere else to go and they saw some friendly faces. I mean,
Yeah.
what was wrong with the fact that they were welcoming in people who didn't have access to public facilities because the laws that the local laws are used to stop people from using toilets, stop them from sleeping anywhere that might be comfortable, stop them from being able to afford to shower or anything like. I mean, this was the way that Occupy was demonized. I think in the mainstream media. I think. I mean, one of the other sort of enormous successes of Occupy, of course, is that it involved thousands of people, all of whom sort of left those camps with skill sets that they didn't think they had in some cases, and who have immediately been able to put them back into practice. I mean, so it's interesting that occupation has become a kind of default of inverted commas protest in the years since Occupy, because people have experience of this. They have an absolute lesson in how to do it, how to set up a camp, how to set up a kitchen, how to set up, composting toilets. I mean, and these things are done at pretty much every festival you go to. This is the sort of the standard practice, and actually it tends to work not entirely smoothly, but it tends to work pretty effectively. And had the camps not been evicted by force, then they would have, I think you're right, they would have run for much, much longer. And you can think of examples like the ZAD, which was again, inverted commas, a protest that was set up in France against an airport. And what happened was that activists went along there, set up a camp to physically prevent this airport being built. They set up in a forest. They made connections with the local people, the local farmers. They garnered their support. And actually, what happened in the end, although the camp was again evicted, they stopped the building of the airport. These are fantastic successes. And I think, the thing about Occupy was it 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 had enormous ambition, I guess. And I think part of that ambition was to force a choice on behalf of the American government to reconfigure democracy against the corporations. Now, I don't think that was ever going to happen, and it certainly wasn't going to happen on the back of an occupation. Um, but what came out of that aspiration was enormously more powerful, actually. I think in terms of demonstrating that people could not only organize themselves, they could set up institutions, they could articulate their aims and principles, they could organize alternative decision making processes. All of this, entered the culture and is in the culture now for good. And from that point of view, I think it was a fantastic success.
Yeah, I think that's right. I agree with all of that. And if you you can call, squatting on the land, occupying the land that would have become an airport protest if you want. But if there had been a march and people had held up their signs that said no airport, we
Yeah,
all know that airport
yeah, exactly.
would have been built.
Yeah,
Um, I
yeah,
also want to mention, the claim that Graeber makes. I think it's true. I think James C. Scott makes this claim as well, that everyone always says, "Oh no, what if the people get out of hand?" and the government is overthrown, and that's always bad. Except for, of course, the people that got out of hand and established whatever the government is that currently exists. It was good that those people got out of hand because they bequeathed to us this beautiful governmental system that we have now. Thank goodness for whoever, Benjamin Franklin or uh, Oliver Cromwell or whoever it is that made the system that we have now, which is good. But if anyone else gets out of hand, that
Yeah.
would be bad because, of course, the system we have now is good because of a democratic uprising and protests and the tearing down of the system. But it should never ever happen again until it does, and then we'll praise those people as well. But only if they win. If they
Yeah, that's right.
lose, they were bad.
Yeah, I mean, there's something about, I suppose, Occupy as again as an example of a it was a networked event, so and very well networked. So I mean, it spread, from adbusters, and there was a kind of a preliminary planning meeting, but it then spread by mimicry and imitation, and in that sense it was horizontal. And I think the difference between that kind of direct action and, say, the 6th of January is that 6th of January was curated, right? And not only was the aim in directly sort of opposed to the principles of direct action, which are that people take the action themselves. I mean, an insurrection like that was designed actually to put somebody else into power, so, who could then sort of tell
Yeah.
everybody else what to do. But it was the seeds of this were sown in a very different kind of way, and I think there's something about that, which is instructive in the sense that, generally speaking, I don't think the logic of direct action is towards a sort of a homogenous outcome. I mean, you have to expect that there are going to be differences, and there certainly were in Occupy. I mean, in some camps, these were very difficult to negotiate through the consensus decision making process, and because of the emphasis that they put on real democracy, they were very difficult to navigate within those camps. Nevertheless, I think the brilliance of Occupy was that it anticipated that kind of difference, as opposed to sort of wanting to clamp it down, or to sort of curate something that was going to be homogenous from the outset, that was going to be directed towards a very singular aim in that sense.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I think it's really important to remember that if we, if we're going to have anarchy, it should be harmonious in a sort of Kropotkian way, but it should also be, chaotic and disorderly
That's
in the
right.
sense that human beings are messy, and we can't pretend that those problems could go away.
That's right.
Um, Nor should we believe the voices of the defenders of the establishment who claim that those problems have been or will be
Yeah,
resolved by
that's that,
police and courts.
that's exactly what I wanted to say. I think I lost my thread halfway
No,
through.
I
So I don't think that you can expect that a direct action, something like Occupy, can be ideologically configured from the outset. I think you have to anticipate that it's not going to be. So the difference between different kinds of actions is not that a direct action is good if it agrees with us, and it's bad if
yeah,
it doesn't.
yeah,
Actually, it's the disagreement that makes it valuable, and the difference for me is how far it's been curated externally.
yeah, yeah. Well, that's a really important point from January 6th, because I've been a pretty bold in my opinion, defender of January 6th, insofar as I have been very nervous about all the statements for people who have said, like, what, you can't march against the government. I did not
Mm,
like all of the people on the left who said you can't march against the government.
mm.
That is a principle
Yeah, of
that
course. Yeah.
I that a country founded on revolutionary action against the government
Yep.
cannot uphold. The idea that marching against the government based on the orders of a billionaire in order to enact a bureaucratic authoritarian palace
Yeah,
coup. I could not be more against
yeah,
that.
yeah,
But
precisely
I
right.
do always want to take the moment where I say, like, no, the people who said, like, how dare they
Yeah,
march against the police? Well,
yeah,
that's
yeah.
marching
That's
against
a
the
dangerous,
police.
very dangerous ground. I agree, and
Yeah.
I think also you have to, bear in mind that of course there are lots of different people in that march,
Yeah.
appealing to lots, so but it is but as I say, I think the curation of it, and the aim that causes me to pause rather than actually the principle, if you like. I mean, if
Yeah.
you can't march on,
And, and again, the idea that certainly I think the people who made those claims about, it is wrong to march against the government, they I think they were wrong, but I agree that you'd be talking about a Robespierrean or a
Mm,
Stalinist project if you were imagining left wingers marching, if January 6th, Occupy was not the opposite of January 6th. If socialists had done a January 6th thing, there would not have been, I think, a lot of anarchists in that group, right? I mean,
mm,
that seems to be one of the key
yeah,
anarchist ideas. You're not looking to install
that's right.
a different
Yeah,
person
that's
in
yeah,
in
exactly.
that seat of power.
That's right. That's right. And so the appeal to the action works entirely differently.
Yes. Yes, I think that's absolutely right. We should head towards the end. I guess there is one thing that I wanted to bring up, which is, window breaking. Do anarchists still defend window breaking? Because when I was growing up, I was in Pittsburgh when there was the G7 or G8 summit. It was a big deal. I got stuck in traffic for hours because Obama's motorcade went by. And I've never heard so much vitriol against anarchists in my life, and I'm happy to participate against that vitriol. I'm on record as against window breaking. There was just some kid, maybe a small group of kids, only one that they caught, who broke a lot of windows downtown, including a truly beloved breakfast place.
Mm,
And he did it in the name of anarchy or anarchism. And I know that that's it's insured and
mm.
someone will pay for it, and it made a point or something. But I guess maybe I'm just a bourgeois liberal enough that breaking the window of a bank, it's going to be insured, so it's not going to hurt the bank, and then someone's going to have to fix that window, and that someone is probably going to be a poorly paid employee. So this is just my bugaboo, I guess. Breaking
Breaking
windows.
windows.
Are
Yeah.
we still
So
doing it?
I'm sure that people still. I mean, it's about sort of property damage and diversity of tactics, isn't it? And I guess um, and there's an issue also about communication and targeting. So what is it that you want to communicate through your action, and how are you going to enable people to start a conversation or to have a dialogue with you through the action that you take. And I guess I'm kind of reminded partly of what something William Godwin says. So he's writing in the sort of the aftermath of the French Revolution, and he says, of course, when people have been when people let loose their anger, it comes out in all kinds of ways, and some of which are really not constructive. But over time, people learn. Just as William Morris says, after a while, you learn that you can make better furniture because you get more practiced at it. And politics is like that too. That once the anger, the immediate anger dissipates, then there are other ways in which you can think about the actions that you take. So I think I'd give some latitude, if you like. I mean, certainly during the social justice protests. I mean, but it becomes habit, I guess, and that becomes, once something becomes habit, it's something that we do, or some people do on protests, and it doesn't seem to serve any purpose. I'm not sure why that's done. I mean, there's all sorts of problems too about, agent provocateur, who's breaking the windows exactly. Is it the kid who's angry about something, or is it actually just the police dressed up? Um, but I am a defender of diversity of tactics, because I think if you're, and this was something that really comes out strongly for me in the Oakland Occupy, that, I mean, one of the reasons that the camp breaks up is because there's this huge argument about, and it manifests itself through the general strike, where there is property damage done, including damage to some businesses that were 100% behind the occupation, and that's just counterproductive. But the sort of the more weighty or serious point about diversity of tactics was about, not legislating for, sectors of the population who were most subject to police violence, and saying to them, you cannot, defend yourselves. You have to follow our line. Otherwise, we're going to get a bad press. And that's the point at which there has to be that discussion, rather than a blanket rule. And how you negotiate that, and how you support each other in those very different kinds of repertoires of action, if you like, I think is a really, really important lesson to learn. So I think it extends beyond the smashing of windows. I think the smashing of windows in Seattle and thereafter kind of triggered this. But I think there is a really sort of important point about how we extend mutual aid in situations where we know that some people are going to face far greater harms and hazards than we ourselves. And it's something that Scott Crow talks about in when he was involved in after Katrina, and went down into New Orleans, and he has a really brilliant discussion about this, which I tell everybody to read.
Okay, I'll try and find that and put a link into the show notes. I just realized, when you mentioned general strike, I realized I didn't bring up, the term general strike, or the idea of revolution, and maybe we can save that for
Another trip.
next year. Yeah. But then I'm going to try something. I really like these being, I mean, not just our conversations, but as a general rule, I like my show to be conversations, and they just sort of end when they end. But I'm going to try something I've never done before. Maybe briefly sum up real quick, sort of what we've said, and you can respond, and then we can be done. So I think as I try and recall the last 50 minutes or so we've been talking, the idea is, insofar as protest is, directed at the legitimate government and asking it to exercise power legitimately
Mhm.
in your interest, there's probably nothing wrong with it, but there's nothing very anarchist
Mm.
about it either, and we could guess it's probably not very effective. And then, of course, there's the everyday anarchism of solving these
Mhm.
problems, by ourselves, which, sounds great and is great. I'm for everyday anarchism,
Mhm.
hence the name of the show. But then everyday anarchism does and will bring you into a collision
Mm.
with the legal and political and economic system that demands that you go home or protest, but definitely don't put a tent
Yeah.
in Zuccotti Park. And there is a time and a place for direct confrontation with those systems. Call it what you will: direct action, activism,
Mhm.
dissent. And then there's, I don't know, maybe that's as far as I'm willing to go. And then beyond there's innumerable problems and challenges and victories and successes
Yeah.
that all must be negotiated and navigated by the activists on the ground, with the awareness that what they're trying to do is do something,
Yeah.
not convince the government
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
do something.
Yeah, and I think that's the only caveat I would then enter about the initial sort of protest. So I think you're right. protests that you have to get permission to run. You have to it's a kind of elaborate form of lobbying. Um, is not anarchist. It's and often not particularly effective either. Um, but it's a ground for people to learn. It's a ground for
Mm.
people to rehearse their politics, their arguments. It's a way of networking. It's a way of building solidarity. So I wouldn't, entirely dismiss it, but hopefully it's the train that takes you uh, on to other things.
Yeah, I think I'm sympathetic to that. I think that would probably be my view. I hear the voice again of the radicals in my head who say like, no, what it actually is, and it's almost like a Freudian way, like it's a sublimation of the energy. It's, you get out and it felt good and you yelled and you had your sign, and then you go home and don't come back out for another year. I think it could be either of those things. So
Mm.
let's just say if you're out at one of those fun pussy hat wearing gentle protests, make sure you're meeting people and talking to them about what comes
Yeah,
next. It's not job done.
yeah, yeah. Or how you join on in their local action wherever it is they're doing it. Yeah, yeah,
Okay. Well, this once again was wonderful, Ruth.
yeah. It's lovely.
Any last thing you'd like to say before we go?
No, I think. Sorry for the printer, but no, I really enjoyed that. And as I say, I find it it's a really tricky topic, I think, and repays conversation.
Okay. Well, this has been 3 years of everyday anarchism, and we'll do this again in September of 2025, if not sooner. Thank you, Ruth.
Thank you.